G'day and welcome back to the Talking Leadership TV podcast series. Thank you for joining us again. My guest today is Dr. Shane Doyle. Shane grew up on a dairy farm near Beaudesert in Queensland, and at 18 he embarked on a policing career which spanned over 3 decades. In the Queensland Police Service he rose to the senior leadership position of inspector. Shane's police postings included stints as a criminal investigator, and he performed various roles in both country and city locations. As an operational commander, Shane led up to 250 police and managed complex crime operations and major events. He is also experienced in leading major projects and large training portfolios, including managing the educational requirements of over 1,000 personnel with budgets in the millions. After taking early retirement from policing, Shane plucked up the courage to plunge headfirst into the world of academia by completing a PhD in police leadership and securing a full-time lecturing position at CQ University. Shane enjoyed teaching in diverse criminal justice and project management subjects and received awards for excellence in teaching. The pandemic presented Shane another opportunity to retire early, this time from full-time university life. He now runs his consultancy business undertaking research in policing. Shane still maintains ties with academia, performing an adjunct scholar's role supervising PhD students. He is also a curriculum board member with the Leaders Institute, responsible for developing a Masters in Police Leadership. Furthermore, Shane is closely involved with developing world education in his role as Secretary of the Management Committee of one of the largest educational charities in Bangladesh, titled Cooperation in Development, founded by Fred Hyde AM. Shane enjoys a lifetime passion for learning. He holds a PhD from CQU, a Bachelor of Business and Master of Business through QUT, and a graduate certificate in applied management through the AIPM. Today we're going to have a discussion around Shane's leadership pathway from the context of the world of work and academia. Thanks for joining us, but enough from me, and I'll hand over to Shane. Shane, again, thanks for joining me, mate. So we are
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, mate, look, I think with these things, people don't understand that I'm forever grateful for people that give up their time to have these discussions. But on this occasion, where although we're focusing on leadership, we're looking at your leadership journey and some of what you've done in your research career to inform the conversation today, which I think offline I've spoken to you about, that is of extreme interest to me as a early career researcher and someone who wants to know what others have done and what they've been through. Not that we're going to cover all of that. Obviously, we need to keep it pegged to the leadership journey. I think this one will be interesting for those that have a more than passing interest in leadership and how that plays out in a university career. But you didn't start with a university career, so let's go to question one. This one's in 3 parts. So, what led you to a career in policing to start with?
Yeah, it's a good place to start, and thanks, Aaron, for the introduction. I joined the Queensland Police Service, more by accident than design. It was a situation where I was born and bred on a dairy farm about 30 kilometres southeast of a small township called Beaudesert. And for the first 18 years of my life, I was on this dairy farm, and I knew from the outset that I wasn't destined to be a farmer. So my mother, who was very wise and one of my early mentors in my life, said to me, "Shane, you've got to decide what you want to do. Obviously, this is not it." And I said, "No, it's not it." So we sat down, we brainstormed through a few ideas, and she threw in policing. And I said, "Well, policing? Are you serious? Like, you've got to get your hair cut really short." It's funny, things you think of when you're 18, isn't it? And she said, "Look, just throw in for it." So just to humour her, and I suppose to keep her happy, I threw in for it. And lo and behold, I got accepted at the academy. So that sort of started my career. I wanted to be independent right from the start. So I never wanted to be a uni student, even though I was accepted at QUT for the School of Business. So I could have gone down that track and done the degree straight away, but I'm pretty happy I didn't do that. So then I went on, and the rest is probably history. Over 3 decades in policing, and it was an interesting and varied career. I enjoyed most of it. There were some challenges along the way, and I enjoyed the academy training, which was illuminating. And almost at one stage, I almost left the police at 23. And luckily, one of my mentors, a wise old sergeant at the country station I was posted at the time, a place called Roma, he said, Shane, he said, do you really want to go back and become a student and learn how to be a teacher? Just go to the academy and become a lecturer at the police academy. And I said, are you serious? And he said, yeah. He said, they're desperate. So I ended up applying for it, and lo and behold, that started my education career in the police. So I suppose a bit of a teacher by de facto teacher in that respect. Yeah. But yeah, it was a good career and I enjoyed it. So
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. What was the light bulb moment that stopped you going to uni early and going straight to the police? Now,
I didn't want to be poor. Didn't want to be poor student,
okay,
Eric.
right, okay, and that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone can make the claim that you become rich while being a full-time student. I can attest to that.
Not at all.
And I guess one thing that's curious to me, and I have been and maintain my support for the agriculture and fishery sectors. And I get a mix of views as the kids of farmers that I speak to and fishermen about whether or not they want them to stay on the family farm or to stay commercial fishing. Did that weigh on you making that decision to move away from farming?
It did. That my father secretly harbored this desire that as his eldest son, I was bestowed this right, and I didn't get any of that when I was 18. But being the eldest son, I did have a responsibility, I suppose, to take the farm over, and I went against that, which was difficult in some respects because I knew I let him down, even though he didn't actually say it. So yeah, it was. They want the farm to carry on. They want the next generation to pick up, and not to lose what they built. So yeah, it did weigh heavily on me. But I knew ultimately, my gut told me I wasn't cut out for the land. So it was just unfortunate, I suppose.
Yeah, and that tends to happen. One guest whose podcast I haven't released yet was the complete opposite. He knew, I guess, at birth that he was going to be on the farm, and that's all he wanted to do. And I think with human beings, being what we are, following your gut that way, I need to tell you what you don't want is a good indicator of what not to do. And sometimes listening to that little voice is important. So back to the questions, if I could, and I'm interested in the next element. An overview of your leadership journey. What did that look like?
It was interesting and varied, particularly in policing. It took different forms, but I started my leadership journey at the police academy, actually, as a police cadet, because I knew I had a tinkering or inkering for to be a leader, or just to have that responsibility. So I volunteered, or at least I advocated to be the squad leader of my squad. And I think it was, the last person standing, and I just happened to get the baton. So I thoroughly enjoyed that over a period of 18 months. I knew I experienced the influence, the power, but I suppose in a nice way, being through influencing people. But when I got into policing at 19 years of age, and very, very young, obviously, and quite naive at being a country boy, my first foray into, say, domestic violence was that we went to this domestic violence incident, the first one for me, and I was really quite nervous and apprehensive about it. And I had about 2 months service, so it was very, very, very early on. And my partner, the officer who was with me, I was 19 and he was 39, and he had two or three kids, whatever. And the domestic dispute that we were going to was between a husband and wife, and they were arguing over their wayward 16-year-old daughter who was drinking and having sex and all these terrible things. So they were arguing over that. When I arrived, they looked at me, and then they looked at a much older guy, and they said, "Well, who are we speaking to?" And the 13-year-old, 9-year-old partner said to me, "This guy here." And they said, "Are you serious?" And I tried to talk to them because I was thrown in the deep end. I wasn't expecting the job. Thrown in the deep end, and I struggled, and I'm trying to get some words out. And my father eventually said, "How old are you?" I said, "Oh, I'm 19." And he said, "We've got a son 19 and a daughter 16. So you're trying to tell me about how to bring up my 16-year-old daughter? You're kidding, aren't you? I want to talk to this guy." And he pointed to the 39-year-old guy. So I just simply had to walk back and accept defeat. It was really embarrassing. And also, it was a real learning experience for me, because sometimes you're thrown into those leadership positions and you're so underprepared, ill-equipped. I didn't have any idea what I was doing. And I think what I learned from that is that you've got at least, if you can have some heads up, have some preparation and be prepared, but I learned a valuable lesson from it. And I didn't really, I learned the lesson, but the experience sort of burned into my memory that you've got to be ready for these challenges.
Yeah, I think you're underselling it, mate. Burned in your memory is probably not the best way to describe it, because it's like it's right there on the surface. I was just going to say that's a really nicely packaged up example of ageism working the other way. And
Sure.
I think some people have been through that. You made me remember something as you were describing that when I first started in my former role, and this is going back now 12 odd years, but I was still in sort of my mid 30s at the time. I went out and met some people in my industry up North Queensland, and I've been told by more than a few people that I have a baby looking face, so I don't look my age. So, talking to you now, I'm pushing 50 and people don't tell me that I look like that I am, but I am. And I went up there and I got Sonny more than one time, and I kept thinking in my head, Sonny, I got 2 kids. I've been married for 20 years. I'm no one's little kid brother, mate. What the hell? And I think you cop that that kind of ignorance because it just exists. But I guess in that circumstance, when you've got parents that worried about their kids, the last thing they want to encounter is what they're worried about, looking at them, giving them advice, whereas they didn't understand. And I'm sure they, to this day, probably feel bad about the encounters that you were there to try to de-escalate a situation that could get quite seriously messy. And they're not thinking straight, but you are. And I think that world is an extremely interesting one, but two, you're being asked at a very young age to go into situations that even some adults would have a difficulty engaging in. So and again, you can see that it's sort of lives at the top of your memory when you're bringing that one up, that it was a learning thing for you. So you had a career in the police force, and then you transitioned into a career into research. So before I ask you the next question, how did you transition away from policing to research, so that I can make the next couple of questions kind of make some sense?
Yeah. Can I just pick up on a previous point about that issue with domestic violence?
Sure.
So the other thing I forgot to mention was the learning experience, was that you can't replace, and my research subsequently backed all this up, you can't replace lived experience. So let's rewind that whole scenario. And if my senior partner had said to me, have you been to domestic violence before? And I said, no. He said, look, I've been to heaps. You follow me, you watch me, take notes, and then at the end we'll debrief, and you just watch, you observe, and then we'll do it that way. So he had all this lived experience and I didn't. And I just thrown in the deep end. So you can't replace that. So I was just a quick little highlight from my research. Yeah. So that's the main learning I came out of that, and supported by the research.
Yeah, and I understand that, and I guess in the moment you're not thinking about you're in the moment, and so we're talking here hindsight, and that's always a beautiful thing, because you can look back and go, well, it could have gone multiple ways, and this is what I learned after the fact. But damn, it'd be good to have that thinking before you got in, and I get that. So again, you transitioned. No, that's okay. You transitioned from policing to research with a policing focus. Why the switch?
Well, to be fair, I'd always been a bit of a researcher during my time in policing. So I'd done all this part-time. So I'd done the undergraduate in business. I went on and did that in my 20s. Then I had a hankering for more study. I don't know. I think I'm, glutton for punishment, obviously. So I went into a master's program, and I just didn't do a master's by coursework. I did it by research. So within the police, I was researching the roles and competencies of senior managers, of middle managers. And so I got a bit of a taste for the research then. And then I'd always hankered for this PhD, but I wanted to remain married, to, happily married to my wife. And she said, "Oh no, just don't do that. It's just too much work." And she was right to a point. But ultimately, I got to my early 50s, and then lo and behold, they were offering voluntary redundancies in the Queensland Police Service. Do you believe that, Eric? For the first time in the history of the Queensland Police Service, they were offering voluntary redundancies to senior police, because I was an inspector at that stage, top 2 or 3% in the rank structure. So I thought, wonderful, I can get paid out, and then I can do this PhD research in leadership, which again was always an area I'd liked. So that was the segue.
The opportunity looked like it came knocking, and I'm a big believer that when you know a career is finished, you're looking for the next career, and it's almost like the study was prepping you for the next step in your career, even though you might not have been planning it that way. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So let me ask you this: briefly describe what your research was focused on.
So I've alluded to it, but in my 50s, obviously, a mature age student, I always harbored this passion for leadership, and also more specifically how leaders learn the art of leadership. How do they become leaders? And I had this view that if I go to the right course, if I go to the right program, if I listen to the right workshop or something like that, I would then be equipped with these skills. So what I learned from along the way was that that's not the way you become a leader. And it was a really edifying experience for me. So I used what they call a mixed methods approach, which I understand you've also used in your research. And so essentially some quantitative data, so the focus groups and the interviews, and so quantitative being surveys, and mix that up, the surveys, and then the qualitative being the interviews. So I did a combination of both. My central premise was, and it hadn't been done in policing, never been done before worldwide. There was general research saying, okay, about 70% of leadership is acquired in the field, so on the job experiences, the lived experiences sort of thing, through challenging assignments and exercises and things that take you out of your comfort zone, things that test you. Sometimes it's sink or swim, and you got to swim. And then there's 20% of that learning how to become a leader is involved in mentoring and coaching. So relationships, finding people in the organisation or elsewhere that can help you, give you advice, a guiding hand, support, that sort of thing. And the last 10%, believe it or not, is the actual structured formal learning, which is the leadership course, the workshop, whatever, the podcast, all these things. So if you put that all together, I thought, well, does this also operate in policing? And my research indicated that very similar percentages. That's how the leaders. Obviously, there were other things that I came out of my research, but that was one of the big things. And that led to my role as a full-time lecturer at university, which was a big bonus out of the PhD.
It sounds like one led to the other, I guess, that doing the research, particularly in an area that had never been done before, that's always breaking new ground, piques people's interest, particularly university, and particularly if you come from the work culture that you did. So if we wrap all of that up, and again, I'm asking this as a macro level question, but feel free to get into the weeds as much as you need to. What's your philosophy on leadership?
It's a big question, isn't it? It's a big question. And I think my philosophy has changed over time. I think it was pretty simplistic. When I started, my philosophy was, get out there and get things done, and people will follow you. And it just doesn't, lived experience has changed and molded my way about my ideas about leadership. I think can we talk specifically about leadership in policing? Is that okay to go into that area? Because obviously that's one I'm most comfortable with.
Yeah, and that follows the next lot of themes and questions we've got here. So if you want, we can merge these two and you can make the link however you like. It's about talking about the distinct nature of policing from a leadership context. So if you want to go with that, we can go there first. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So one number one thing I find really frustrating about the leadership in policing is that the popular media, the social media, the streaming services, the commercial TV, they all project this leadership in the policing. So the experts out there are saying this is how you do leadership, and this. But the reality in policing is the experts are saying this is how you do policing in terms of it's out on basically arresting criminals on the road. This is the siege, this is the situation, and so on. But that's not really representing what policing is all about. So the culture, what I found is that the culture in policing is very, very influential, as is the culture in general, leadership in other organisations, and also the context. So, being a police officer in our leader in policing is not the same as BHP or Apple or all those organisations. Very much is the context, and that's what my PhD research was also came out very clearly. That context is king. So there's not one universal prominent leadership style that everyone can adopt. So if we go back to my leadership philosophy, that in a nutshell is that if you try to grab onto one leadership style, leadership philosophy, then it may not work for the organisation or the context you're working in. So that's what I find about also frustrating about the popular media is going back to that issue, but not just policing, but the popular media leadership myth is that there is some perfect leadership style out there, and they'll come out with books and podcasts and all these things saying, "Oh, this is the way to lead," and it's so untrue because it might sell a lot of books, but that style mightn't necessarily suit what you're trying to achieve in the organisation that you're working in. So I look at it from like a smorgasbord. My philosophy on leadership is that you go around and you simply look at different traits and characteristics of different people that you admire as leaders, or you aspire to be leaders, their particular something about their leadership, and you take what you need from those particular individuals, and then you make it your style, unique style. That I suppose that's my overriding thing about leadership. The other thing is leadership is also leading people through the journey, and a lot of leadership involves influence, but also a thing called change. And every time I've been in a leadership position, it's been about trying to manage the anxieties and the expectations from the troops about what the change entails. And that's a challenging thing for a leader to do, because every bit you do about leadership is got a change component. And when you don't have people or leaders that help them through that process and nurture them and mentor them and support them all the way through, then things can go pear-shaped very quickly.
There's a lot to unpack there, and you've answered the context in which you work and how that shapes leadership, and you've very much clearly articulated what your philosophy of leadership is. A couple of questions that come to mind here around policing, and first, let me make a generalization a little bit from a culture perspective. I've had the good fortune to speak to some serving and some ex people in the Australian military and some from overseas, and I get I get the distinct impression now. This may not be 100% accurate, but because of those cultures in which leadership is molded and shaped and hopefully effective in both those contexts, the military and the policing context, they have to be to some degree flexible, and your ability to be self-reflective and change your practice is needed, because the dilemmas that cops that are publicly facing the community will be different to those our police forces that are in-house or back of house doing what you do as you go up the chain. So you're less out in front of the public, and other younger police or less experienced policemen are out in the community. And I think you can't have a one size fits all. And it always makes me laugh a little bit that I came into my research thinking, why can't I come up with a unified theory of leadership that covers every goddamn eventuality, and it's never going to happen. And I understand now why that is.
Mm, mm.
You can't take away the contextual element to what is required of leaders. However, where I differ with some of the research, and this is my own philosophy, not tested by any research yet, is I think there are some core leader capabilities that you can't escape from having to be
Sure.
more effective than somebody else. Now, I'm not saying everyone doesn't have the capabilities that I've got in mind, but I think how you nurture and build those capabilities is going to single you out as being a more effective leader than somebody else. Now,
Sure.
from a policing context, did you ever compare and contrast that sector to other sectors to find if there were some leadership learnings or any learnings you could draw on in your own research?
Yeah, it's a good question, Eric, and thanks for asking it, because that was probably leads to my next point I was going to make, is that when I joined the police, Wise, instructor at the academy, he said, look, you've got to be prepared. It's this profession, I suppose occupation, arguably profession, is not for the faint-hearted. And he sat back in his chair and he said, you'll see the worst of people and people at the worst. And I reflected on that saying many times over my career, and I thought, gee, that's just so true. When you come in situations where you see people under terrible stress, terrible suffering, anxiety, emotional distress, grief, and another saying that sort of crept in later in policing is that you deal with the mad, the bad, and the sad, and that's also very much on very true. So the reason why I think police leadership arguably sets itself apart from, I'd say, the vast majority of professions, because I think leadership in the military is probably a separate category altogether, which we won't get into because I'm not an expert in that area. But what I find interesting about that whole thing is that when you're leading from the front and you've got to make, at some stage, life and death decisions, that's where your leadership's different, because when you're, say, working in office, the most serious thing you can pick up is probably a ballpoint pen or something, or your mouse, and throw it at someone. But when you're dealing in a policing context, officers can pull up someone and have a gun pointed at them. So that's why that use of lethal force. And I think from a frontline, leadership point of view, that's where the difference is. The leadership in a corporate area where you've got time, you've got resources, and you've got that ability to reflect. But when you have to make a decision straight away as a leader, and the troops are looking at you saying, do we enter that house or not? Because we've got information that there's an armed offender, there's a hostage, or do we step back? And they're all looking at you, and you've got to make the call. Now, if you make the bad call, then officers can get shot, the hostage can get killed, and you imagine that on the front page of the Courier Mail the next morning, and the Commissioner of Police reading that and almost choking on her Wheaties. That would be terrible to think that you made the wrong call. But most professions, most leaders don't need to make life or death decisions.
Yeah, I think we're in a bad place as a society when you have to say to me, well, what's it going to look like when it hits the papers? Well, it's going to get sensationalized, but it was a call that was made in the heat of the moment. Right. And sometimes people make bad decisions, but it doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean shouldn't reflect on a career. And and unfortunately, the scrutiny that the police are under, it makes that decision making that much more scrutinized, which I think is not the same in other industry sectors. You're right. I would agree. And look, I claim no expertise in leadership in the military. All I'm going on was just the conversations I had with people in that environment, and both policing and military fascinate me, how leadership is developed in those contexts. So let me ask you, describe a few or one or many challenging experiences which defined your leadership. That's part one. And then
Mhm.
compare that to your research findings, if you can, for me, Shane.
Mhm. Sure. So picking up on that instance of frontline leadership, which I think arguably sets policing apart from other types of professions, organisations. So an example there was once this is a few years ago now, I was an operational commander, which meant that you were the most senior ranking officer. I was an inspector, operational commander, and I looked after all the south side area of Brisbane. So paint the scenario, it always happens at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. You're the senior person. There's no one else around. Everyone else of high rank is in bed having a nice little sleep. And I get called to this address at Baranda, a suburb in southeast of the city, only about stone's throw from the city. And the complaint that we had in summary was the mother of this person who was 21. The mother rang up quite distressed, 000 call. My son just rang me. He's intoxicated. He's had ingested a large amount of unknown quantity of drugs. He is bipolar, schizophrenic. He's suffering an episode, and he's saying now that he needs to do something drastic to himself, self-harm. I do remember specifically what he was saying he was going to do. He's going to get a carving knife in his ground floor unit and then cut off his testicles. And we took that threat very seriously because of his state. He did have a history of mental illness. He did have a history of drug abuse. He was living in the unit by himself with very little support, and his mother was distressed. We went to the address. We cordoned off the ground floor unit. We tried to make entry and we couldn't. Tried every window, aperture, whatever. And all the troops, by that stage, there was probably about 4 crews, about 8 police officers, a couple of dog squad units too on top of that. And they all looked at me and said, well, what are we going to do, boss? And I tell you what, you were really put on the spot there. So do I go in? Potentially, he could be in a pool of blood on his bed and be actually bleeding to death. So I had to make a decision. Do I go in? Or he could be hiding behind the door, waiting for something to come in, and one of my officers gets stabbed. Or do I wait? Do I sit back and wait for the Special Emergency Response Team, or what's commonly known as SWAT in America, but CERT in Australia? Do I wait for them up to an hour before they actually would come to the address? So I'm going, I've got to make a decision. The troops want me to make, they're pleading with me to make a decision. I have to make a decision. Their eyes are pleading. Just what do we do? So I got together 3 or 4 of the biggest guys I could see. They were all men at that stage in the police who attended. There was no female officers. And I said, look, are you okay to get, for you vest up, are you okay to go in? Are you comfortable with that? And they said, yes. So I did check, I did ask the question. And they had to, what they call a 10-pound key, which is a 10-pound sledgehammer, smash the front door in. And at that stage, I was following them in like a little halfback because I'm not a big guy. These big guys were the forwards, literally in policing, in footballing parlance. But we walked in and ran into the room, and then we found him in the bedroom, lying on the bed with the knife in his hand. And luckily, he hadn't carried through with his threat. So, my heart's pumping out of my chest thinking, what's going to happen? But they're the sort of things that you walk away and go, what did I learn out of this? And my research indicates that, the troops want you to make a decision. That's the main thing. They want to follow you, but you've got to make a decision. You can't forward it to the planning committee. You can't sit around and wait for funding committee to form and discuss things. You are it. So I would argue that there's not too many other professions where frontline leadership comes to the fore like that.
Well, so you're telling me you can't call the commissioner at 1 or 2 in the morning and ask him for his advice? Wow. Yeah, well, I think
that's your call.
I think those senior fat cats should do more of that on the ground. No, I get it. Wow, that would leave some things in your head to be thinking about. And I would, because you can. I mean, you paint a vivid picture of that. You can imagine what would be younger police officers looking at you, not almost begging for direction, but going, well, you've got to make the call without actually saying it to
Yeah,
you, and that look, I think, is a universal look, even in
yes,
organisations where you're not in
agreed.
policing, where people go, well, what are we doing?
Like a call.
And yeah, particularly when, and I think what you're talking about is in crisis
Mm.
situations, and I'm assuming that look is what people will give people that are responding to emergencies like floods, and seeing the potential, not panic, but the adrenaline build up in those around you, because they're geared and trained to respond to those situations. And so, um, one thing that I think is in the back of their mind is the decision maker needs to give us a call to move forward, and that was you, and you've explained that quite well. Well, I'm glad the situation turned out not bad as you're describing, but it could have gone a number
Could
of
have gone either
different
way.
ways.
It could have
Yeah,
gone
I'm
either
sure you
way.
lost a few nights sleep over that one.
Well, the thing about it is, and you alluded to it earlier, Eric, about the accountability issue and how high the accountability is, and your decision gets scrutinised at length for days and perhaps for coronial inquiries, months and weeks and months later, by many learned people who said, well, maybe Shane, you should have thought about this. Did you think about that? Well, maybe you should have waited. You had all this information. So it's really difficult for a leader in that situation because you know you're going to get judged, you know you're going to get scrutinised, but you've got to have the courage. And so what my research indicated, my PhD, was that the major learning experiences, what really defined their leadership, were things like that. Like you alluded to it, floods, fires, sieges, murder investigations, the big complex ones that put them under a lot of pressure. And luckily it was sink or swim, and luckily they swam. And one of my interviewees said I dog paddled, but I got there, using the same analogy.
Yeah, look, I would I could not do that kind of job, only because for me, thinking about the what if things had gone different scenario after would plague me, because that could have gone all kinds of wrong.
Yes.
And that's something that I don't think any leader with any ounce of truth in their heart would say that they didn't think about either before, during, or after the event. And it strikes me as worth asking this question. After a moment like that in that profession, in the policing profession, do you get any kind of debrief within the service, or someone talks to you about how you're feeling? Are you okay? Like, is that talked about after the event, or is it just taken as part of the job and you move on after the incident?
Look, I think it's a very good question for starters, because it's all about supporting the leaders who are making the hard calls. And I think what tends to happen, and I'm generalising, is that the senior police are considered to be the hardened veterans. So at that stage, I was probably late 30s, early 40s, been in the job for 20 years, and they say, well, Doyley, my nickname, Doyley can handle it. But that they would then go to the police, the dog squad guys and those police that were break the door down, and they'd say, "Are you okay?" And I'm going, "Hello, I'm a little bit stressed myself," but it's really hard. The culture is that you really have to put it up your hand and say, "I'm stressed." It's still a bit, it's a bit iffy, because particularly the more senior you get, you sort of it comes with the territory. You're supposed to be resilient because you got to inspector. You should be able to handle this stuff. It's the young troops we're worried about, which of course is well placed, but also, as you said, it did worry me. It did play on my mind, that decision on that particular occasion, and many decisions have. I do. You wouldn't be human if you didn't worry occasionally, Eric.
Yeah, I get that. It's just a shame that that aspect of the culture is, as you become as you put more time in, time spent in the role, that somehow you've built this impervious shell that you need to be worried about those under you. And look, it's that's not unique to the police. I've seen it in
No,
in the commercial fisheries, talking to typically blokes that have been fishing for 40, 50 years, and when stress gets to them, and they're at breaking point, it seems to me only other fishermen know what those signals are for when they're not 100%. But things like "Are you okay?" and other programs are not necessarily in the fishing industry, but in other industries, asking a very simple question about people's mental health state, there, and it's definitely a leadership thing, is
Mm.
to say, hey, how you going? But if the person is asking and they happen to be a leader, they sometimes want that question asked as well, because maybe they're not 100%. And that doesn't mean at breaking point. I'm just saying maybe 5 seconds to detox might be enough to get it out of your system.
Yeah.
But you need another person to ask that. But we could go down the rabbit hole with some of this stuff, and
Yeah.
I'm enjoying this
Yeah.
conversation, mate. So,
It's,
last,
can I just,
sorry,
sorry,
all
Eric,
right, all right.
sorry, interrupting. Can I just say, I think it's improved. The Are You OK is wonderful. I ran the mental health intervention project for 3 or 4 years, and I think it has improved in the police. Don't get me wrong, but I'm going back, perhaps a decade now. So things are better, but there's still a culture there, because I still talk to a current serving police, and there's still a culture about putting your hand up, like particularly at senior levels. It's still, you can email them and ring them and say, "Are you okay?" But will the officer actually own up, because of this expectation that you're a big tough inspector or senior officer? Yeah,
Yeah, not great, but that'll change over time, and
yeah,
it takes time. I'm not a big believer in just because you've got a new intervention that suddenly it's going to work and change a culture that's been there for
right.
as long as policing has been there. So that I get that. Um, Shane, finally, tell us about your experiences, both positive and negative, in terms of role models in
Mm.
the police context, and then can you compare that to what you did in your research?
Yeah, role models have always been a very important part of my leadership journey. They've helped me along the way. Many times I've gravitated towards certain people who had qualities that I admired, and they inspired me. I mentioned that, alluded to that previously. So I think they also provide you opportunities. When I was an inspector, I was in charge of a training unit in headquarters. Had over 1,000 police and civilians that I was looking after, managing their education and training needs. So it was had a multi-million-dollar budget. So it was a big responsibility. But on top of that, I got a phone call out of the blue from a high-ranking officer and said, "Oh, Shane, we're starting up this mental health intervention project, which I previously mentioned before." And I said, "Oh, what's it about?" And he said, "We want you to lead it up." And I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. What do I get? Do I get an office? All this sort of stuff." He said, "No, you'll be staying where you are." I said, "What, doing the business as usual, and on top of that, doing this project?" He said, "Yeah, yeah." And for a split second, I almost said no, and it was a golden opportunity. And that's the thing, is that these defining moments in your career, your leadership career, when you're given that opportunity, and was by a mentor who saw in me something that I could do this job and get developed from it and become a better leader. And I said, and after about two, he said, "I don't think about it for too long." I said, "Okay, I'll do it," because I didn't want to miss the opportunity. And it was a great project management experience, great for my leadership. So I just don't want to, I really want to emphasize how important it is to seize those opportunities when they come along, because they may not come along again, Eric. That's the thing. So what I find interesting about role models is that I learned so much about them, but I also learned so much about the negative role models, the ones that I thought were duds. Well, in terms of not duds overall, but there are certain things they did were not perhaps the best. So I'll give you an example. When I was in an operational role, you make hundreds of decisions on a shift, hundreds, and occasionally you're going to stuff up. Occasionally you don't. But the thing about it is you make the decisions. Back to my previous point. So this particular manager, let's say, unnamed manager, he took great delight in calling me over to his office, and never told me what it was about, but I knew I was getting in trouble, because it was I only went to his office when I was in trouble. So I went over there, and he said, "Oh, Shane, I'm going to have to talk to you about that decision you made last night with the chopper." I said, "Oh, with the missing person?" He said, "Yeah, yeah." He said, "Mate, that was a bad call." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the feedback." I said, "Why was it a bad call?" And he outlined the reasons, and I said, "I do respectfully disagree." And he looked at me. He said, "You can't do that. I'm higher ranking." And I said, "Well, I just said it." And I said, and by that stage, the third time, I think in a week, he'd called me to the office and sort of railroad tracks over me, give him some good, that negative feedback, really good for you, isn't it, Eric? That negative feedback. So I said, it's his third time this week, and I'm just about getting sick of it. And I said, if next time I come over here, I expect to be congratulated on one of my good decisions. And he just said, leave the office. He didn't say those exact words because I can't repeat them what he said, but he leave the office. So what I learned from that experience was, geez, how important is positive feedback? How important it is to tell the truth, to doing the damn right thing, not get up and catch them doing the wrong thing, catch them the right thing. So an example, quick one, I just made it a mission that I was going to find good things with people and tell them, email them, phone them up, whatever. And I remember this one particular communications officer. She worked in the communication. She made this fantastic call on a dangerous drive. There was police pursuit. She was calm. She was controlled. She made the right call. She told them to terminate, abandon the pursuit. Everything was perfect. I was wrapped. I was listening to the radio. And I said, I'm going to give her an email. So I've gone back to the station and I spent 10 minutes tapping out an email, oh, this is great. That was great. Anyway, I just happened 5 years later to run into that officer. And she said, no. And I still remember you. I know you. And I said, do you? Because you don't, so many people you deal with. I never met her. And she said, yeah, no, you gave me that email 5 years ago and you gave me a big rap. I said, really? And she said, I've used that email, parts of it, to get jobs and get promoted. Thank you very much. It wasn't just that. It was the fact that she said I was really chuffed and I dined out on that email, showed it to my partner. Like, it took me 5 minutes, Eric. And what sort of impact did that have on her life and her career? And I never got it. I never got how important the impact could be. So the upshot of that was that out of my research, the PhD research, that was a really interesting side issue that came out of it that I didn't expect it. And there's not a lot of research about it. That officers repeatedly told me that they learnt more about how not to be a leader from the bad role models, the bad supervisors, the bad bosses. And they'd say, look, I'm never going to do that. One person said, they was castigated in front of the troops. They called them out in the meal room and said, yeah, you stuffed up, you did this. She said, I'll never do that. So it was really interesting how I call them negative wizards. And it's almost reverse role modeling where people actually learn leadership by watching and observing bad leaders and saying, I'll never do that.
Yeah, it's this particular topic, what you've just discussed there, has come up more than once in my conversations, and it's about you remember the good ones and you really remember the bad ones, and I'm talking about good leadership versus bad leadership practice. And although the bad ones for me, given how I'm hardwired, and this, I'm not saying this is the same for everyone, the bad ones are always top of mind because I want to do things completely different to them. And I've had some shithouse bosses in a career, like we've all had, but the good ones, the really good ones, stick in your mind because someone's picked something out of your practice that you've gone, yeah, that's, you've been given praise or whatever the situation was. And yeah, a couple of minutes of bad feedback can destroy someone's confidence for no good reason other than you think it's your job to give negative feedback to keep people on their toes. And I would argue, and I think I would be happy to do the research on this, that I think people become more productive and are better at their jobs when they get constructive feedback rather than you did this wrong versus if we had this to do again, how could we improve on your practice? That's a different conversation than saying you stuffed something up, It's all in the delivery.
It is. Yeah.
I don't have a doubt. Before we go, just let me clarify something with you. You use role model. Did you mean that as a substitute for mentor or something different to mentoring?
It is. There's a subtle difference between, in my research, a subtle difference between role model and mentor, because a role model is someone that may not take on a mentoring role. So you see them from afar, and it may be some of these role models are sometimes unapproachable because of their rank or their level in the organisation, but you like the way that they deal with people. You've seen them from afar. So that's the distinguishing between what a role model and that's a difference. But a role model they can be the same thing, Eric. I'm not trying to say they're separate categories, but sometimes the role model is not always your mentor. I suppose that's what I want to say.
Yeah, no, and I'm not for 1 second wanting you to create new categories here,
No,
because
no,
it's just to, and I don't want to confuse anyone potentially watching or listening. I have a fascination with leaders as teachers, leaders as coaches, leaders as mentors, leaders as role models, and what mix of those are you? And I think particularly there, it's very different depending on the industry that you're
sure.
in. So some leaders are very much focused on being a coach because that's all they need to do, versus being a mentor, which is something different again. And there are some subtle differences. And I like the fact that you brought up role modeling, because I'd never given that much consideration. But yeah, I can recall in my career where I've seen some people and how they've modeled their behavior, and there were some standout human beings and how they managed their work, how they managed their senior people, so how they led upwards, managed upwards, and managed downwards. And a lot of these people, they still their names and their faces stick in my mind, because they, like, if I was going to be the consummate professional, here's my template for what that looked like. And I was lucky in my early career in the public service in Canberra. There was one or two, well, probably two, one gentleman and one lady who stood out to me immediately as, if I'm going to be any kind of leader of people, these are the traits that I want to have in me. And it took a while. I still have some niggling things I've got to work on, like rushing to judgment sometimes is a problem with me. But if anyone in this leadership game says that they don't have a foible or two, that they're not working on it, I don't think they're fed income. That's just a personal view. I have no research to back me up on that. Shane, this was a excellent discussion, and I think we could go down the rabbit hole with any one of these topic areas. And if we could, I'd love to talk to you again on the leadership topic if you're up for it.
Yeah, sure. Enjoyed it. Thanks for the opportunity, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast. And of course, a big thanks to Shane for sharing his perspectives around his leadership pathway in the context of his time in the police service as well as academia. If you like the content, please drop a like, or if you can, please subscribe to the channel. Have a safe week, look after yourselves, and we'll catch everyone on the next episode of Talking Leadership TV.